Government response to social movements. Social movements in the United States have been with us since the beginning. We had the abolition movement against slavery. We had the women's rights movement in the 1800s. We had the women's rights movement in the 1900s and early 1900s to get the women's right to vote. We had civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. We had the women's rights movement again in the 1960s and 70s. We had the gays and lesbians rights movements in 60s, 70s, and again 90s and 2000s. We had people with disability movement. We had Native American movement. So a lot of these movements. So the government response to these, as we've had basically amendments and some federal legislation. The 15th Amendment gave the African Americans the right to vote. The 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote in the 1920s. The 24th Amendment basically stopped the poll tax, and that was the amendment that made the poll tax unconstitutional. The 26th Amendment gave people 18 years to 18, 19, and 20 the right to vote. Federal legislation that's been passed, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, is a landmark legislation. It's a package that was amazing that gave civil rights to African Americans and to many minorities. It guarantees equal voting rights by removing registration requirements biased against minorities, and not just African Americans, but all minorities. Prohibits segregation and discrimination in public accommodations that are involved in interstate commerce. It also bans discrimination by unions, by schools, by employers, doing interstate commerce or work with the federal government if they have a contract or they do business with the federal government. Calls for desegregation of schools. And then it also created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to look at any abuses or any problems with discrimination in the workplace. It had a little bit in voting. It had the guarantee equal voting rights, but we needed a little bit more. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed. And in this, it basically nationwide protection for voting rights prohibits every state and local government from imposing any voting law that restricts or basically creates discrimination against minorities in voting. Outlaws literacy tests. So literacy test was not done in the 24th Amendment. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed the literacy test as a requirement to vote. The Age Discrimination Act, discrimination based on age involved with programs or activities that get federal funding was not allowed. Now, it does not include employment cases because employment cases was handled by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. But it basically said any discrimination in age was not allowed if the group or the school or the place get federal funding. We're going to talk about Title IX in the next slide. So this is the government response to social movements.